Okay, so now let's review what the correct answers were to this activity and see how well you understand the concepts of how the Earth interacts with the sun and causes the seasons and consequently our change in temperatures from summer to winter. All right, so you have your answer sheet 1 through 20. If something I tell you is different than what you have there, you can pause the video, scratch it out, erase it, and write down the correct response. Because if you don't, when we get to a notebook quiz or that notebook final, maybe where you have a reference to this same activity, you might get a little confused. Okay, so which letter represents the winter solstice? And we're going to talk about winter in terms of when we get winter. Unless the problem specifically says southern hemisphere, we're going to say all of these are about when we are talking about the northern hemisphere. So we are up here. This is the northern hemisphere, and this is the southern hemisphere. So winter solstice means when we are pointing away from the sun. And you can see here, we're in the northern hemisphere. We're pointing towards the sun here, and over here we're kind of pointing away from the sun. So the point where we're pointing most away from the sun is the winter solstice. That's the day we start winter, and that would be letter C. Okay, which letter represents the start of fall in Georgia? Okay, now the easiest way to do this, and this will be the same thing when you get to test and quiz, is to figure out summer and winter because they're easy. And we already said that this is winter over here because our part of the earth is tilted away from the sun. Therefore that means this must be summer because we are tilted more towards the sun. We're getting more sunlight. Well, you see the arrows. The arrows are going this way. So you know if you start in summer and you're going this direction and you're going to wind up in winter, you got to say to yourself, what season comes between summer and winter? Well, that's fall. So this here must be the start of fall for us. It's letter B, starts fall. Which letter represents the longest day of the year for Georgia? Once again, you get the most sunlight, you get the longest day at that point where you're tilted most towards the sun. You're leaning into the sun, you're leaning towards it. So as the earth spins, you get more sunlight and you have a longer day. That's going to be A. A is the longest day of the year for Georgia. And you know that in the summertime, like in June, the sun will stay up till like after 9 o'clock at night, and it comes up, it seems like 6 o'clock in the morning. So position A is when Georgia gets its longest day of the year. So when we're leaning most towards the sun and we get the most sunlight. Which letter represents the fall equinox? Well, fall, we already said, starts here at B. The equinox is when both hemispheres get equal sunlight. At A, the north is getting more sunlight. At C, the south is getting more sunlight. But at these two here, both hemispheres get the same amount of sunlight. So it's equal. It's hence the equinox. For us in Georgia, this is our fall equinox because we start fall. This over here would be our spring. Now remember, the southern hemisphere is exactly the opposite for us. When we start fall, they start spring. When we start winter, they start summer. But this question was specifically asking about Georgia. Which letter represents the first day of spring? Well, we just said the spring equinox is over here. That's D. That's when we start spring because this was winter, this is summer, and we know that spring is in between. So as the earth is going from winter, it goes into spring before it gets to summer. And which letter is the earth closest to right now? Well, right now we're September. We're kind of getting towards the start of fall. Fall starts right here. This day here this year is like September 22nd. Well, that means we're moving close to that day. We're right about here right now. We're well past June, which was this day here. We're not to December, even close. This day here is about September 22nd. So that means we're right about here. We're almost to this point. We're almost to the equinox where we start fall. At which letter would the sun set the earliest for us here in Georgia? Well, that's going to be C. That's going to be winter time. That's December. And you know this around Christmas, the sun goes down like at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It doesn't come up till, 7:30, 7:45 in the morning. It's dark for a lot longer period, and that's because we are tilted away from the sun. So we're getting less sunlight. We have shorter days. Sun sets earliest on the winter solstice, which in this diagram is the letter C. Sorry, was that I guess that was a repeat. I didn't change the question. Okay. Which letter is the Earth at on June 22nd? Well, June 22nd, we know that's the start of summer for us. What starts summer is when we are tilted most towards the sun. We're facing the sun. We're leaning this way. So June 22nd, the Earth's going to be at letter A. That's the first day of summer, when we're getting the most sunlight possible, longest days, and we start the summer season. At which letter does summer begin for Georgia? Well, that's the same question, or it has the same answer to a slightly different question. It's A. We start summer when we are leaning more towards the sun. You can see it. Our half of the Earth is leaning towards the sun, whereas over here, our half of the Earth seems to be leaning away from the sun. When your half of the Earth, your hemisphere, is leaning towards the sun, that's the start of summer. When it's leaning away, that's the start of winter. At which letter is the northern hemisphere getting the most sunlight? Well, when are the days the longest? When we're getting the most sunlight, when we're tilted most towards the sun, that's going to be letter A. We're getting the most sunlight at A because we're tilted towards the sun. What season is it from letter C to D? So we got C here and we're moving to D. Well, this starts winter, this starts spring. So every day in here from C to D is winter. Because you don't start spring until this day right here. So every day from C to D is winter time, from end of December to end of March. From number 13, from A to B, the days are getting shorter. Because we're going from summer into fall. And in fall, by now you start to notice the sun's going down earlier. We're getting less sunlight. A is the longest day of the year. So every day after A, it's a little bit shorter, a little bit less sunlight. What has happened to the length of days from D to A, though? Well, D is March. It's the start of spring. A over here is June, start of summer. The longest days are in the summertime. So what's happening to the length of days is that days are getting longer from D to A. That's also why we start to get warmer, because we're getting more sunlight. What's happening from B to C in terms of temperatures? Well, this is fall. This is the start of fall. This is September, which we can still be pretty hot in September, especially in Georgia, but this is December. What happens to the temperatures as we go through fall? They get colder because we're getting less and less sunlight, less and less energy. Temperatures are going to go down. Where's the Earth on March 22nd? Well, what season do you associate with March 22nd? That would be spring. So the Earth is over here at letter D on March 22nd. Which letter represents the spring equinox? Equinox? That is also D, because if this is winter, and we already said everything from C to D is winter, well, what starts after winter? Spring. So spring starts in that one day the hemispheres get equal sunlight. So this is the spring equinox, also called the first day of spring, is this point here, letter D. What's happening to the length of days from letter B to letter C? Well, this is September, and that's coming up, and this is December, like Christmas time. You know what's happening to the length of days. The sun's going down earlier and earlier and earlier, so the days are getting shorter from B to C. Days are getting shorter. What season starts at letter B in the southern hemisphere? Now, there's a couple different ways we can think about this. The best way to think about it is, hey, where do I already know about where I'm at? The northern hemisphere. And I know that the south is the opposite of what I am in the north. So we said this starts summer. And we already said that this starts fall, because we know the season after summer is fall. Well, the southern hemisphere is exactly opposite. So if we are starting fall, they are starting spring. Because we're tilted oppositely, we're on opposite sides of the earth. Whatever's happening in the northern hemisphere happens the opposite way in the south. What letter represents the start of winter in the southern hemisphere? Well, if it's winter in the southern hemisphere, that means it must be summer in the northern hemisphere. And we already said we start summer here. And we know this because we are pointed most towards the sun. We're getting the most sunlight. So we are starting summer in the southern hemisphere. They're starting winter there at letter A.